long time ago, I was at Esalen in a conference that brought together philosophers of the body with body practitioners. The person who organized it is quite famous in the field of somatics from a long time ago. Now I'm not remembering his name. You probably would know it.
Don Hanlon?
Say it again.
Don Hanlon Johnson?
I think it was. Yeah,
Yeah, he was on the podcast.
he was certainly involved in it. Um, and anyway, but most of this stuff, like in my new book, The Healing Body, most of it is coming out of kind of more Western phenomenology of the body, and uh, uh, only later do I kind of pivot more to Eastern traditions. So you know, we can go whatever directions you wish to within the conversation.
Well, so I did, well, of course, I was raised in the West, so my understanding of the body was Western, but then my Eastern practices started when I was really young, like 10. But so, a big question for me is like, embodiment, or what is the body? If we're getting teachings, especially like in Qigong or meditation from the East, it's like, how are these teachers perceiving the body? And then from the Westerner receiving these teachings, are we really talking about the same thing? And so
Yeah.
your understanding of embodiment was quite interesting to me. It kind of reminded me of like D. Harding, or even like Alan Watts would sometimes talk, like, if we feel the body, then that's usually a problem. Like the body's only talking to us if there's a pain, or there's something in there that I find really interesting. But then in another way, it's like, doesn't this kind of, so if we're doing somatic sensing and working internally and sensing the body, how do we square those two ideas of embodiment?
Yeah. So yeah, in my own work, my earliest and most famous book within philosophy of the body is called The Absent Body. It does really stress this notion that when the body is ordinarily functioning well in health, we're caught up on kind of external involvements with the world around us. Our bodily function is relatively unproblematic, so we have no need to reflect upon it. Our internal organs are functioning without causing us pain or distress. So in this early book, The Absent Body, the silent body tends to be identified with health and well-being, and the body speaks up and makes its demands most upon us at times of pain and illness and other kinds of breakdown. And I sort of use that to analyze why in the Western tradition there's such a negative view of the body, why the body is associated with sin and error and disease and obstruction in Western theology and philosophy. I say because we most think about and thematize and interpret the body at these times of breakdown. That's why we have such negative associations. But at the end of that book, I talk about kind of forming one body with the world. And I particularly focus on things like meditation and yogic practices as ways in which we cultivate a positive bodily awareness, which is true in many Asian traditions and somatic practices. And in my newer book called The Healing Body, I do focus more on kind of the powered practices that allow us to, listen to what our body is saying, and also to use our body as an agency for self-transcendence and communion with other people and with the natural world.
Mm-hmm. So the silent body is a healthy body, but then you switch the attention to listening to where you begin to come into communication with the body and use it as a vehicle.
Yeah, well, once again, in this newer book that just came out, the full title, I have it here in front of me, is The Healing Body, Creative Responses to Illness, Aging, and Affliction.
Mm-hmm.
So I am focused primarily on a text for people, which sooner or later is all of us, people who are experiencing, the problematic body, the challenging body, the changing body, and how do we, one strategy would be to kind of move away from your body, find ways to transcend it or ignore the symptoms you're experiencing or refuse to let them hamper your activity. And I do say those can be really valid and helpful strategies for certain people dealing with certain illnesses. But then the other way to go is to pivot toward embracing the body, learning to listen to it more carefully, kind of mindful witnessing, and befriending your body rather than viewing it as a kind of alien antagonist. But I also don't want to neglect the fact that there are many somatic practices and meditative and movement traditions, particularly in Asian thought, that allow you to cultivate a positive kind of healing and usage of the body in such a way that you may never fall sick to begin with, or it may prolong your lifespan, as in Taoism.
Yeah.
So I don't want to focus only on the sick body as the only way in which we learn to listen to the body.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing, because I feel two things are happening here, right? There's a disembodied where we don't pay attention to it, right? We kind of forget about the body, or we're just in the thoughts or the conceptual realm. But then we can pay attention to the body through listening and do like the kind of, you said, somatic listening. But then there's a next kind of phase where you could possibly then begin to consciously do something with the listening and move towards health by interacting with the body. And that seems like there's a level of, you have to know what to do there. So to listen is a skill, but then there's something else on the other side, or where you can develop it from there as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, I've worked with, both with regular physicians, and I am an MD, trained MD. I've also worked with alternative practitioners, different kinds of somatic treaters. And in certain ways, I put my body under the care of their skilled and trained hands and energy fields, and ask for healing. But in other ways, they often help me to learn about and direct me back to what I'm experiencing within my body, and a capacity for kind of self-healing work that isn't dependent exclusively on the practitioner. And, one of the things I take up in the new book, once again called The Healing Body, is that there's a whole lot of practices that individuals dealing with chronic illness or dealing with aging just kind of naturally develop in order to adapt, to be resilient, to creatively deal with whatever are their obstacles or struggles. And they're often developed pretty independent of the medical system. And then when they come in contact with the medical system, a skilled clinician can facilitate that and support that, or they and the system can obstruct that. Wow. And dehumanize the patient or direct them exclusively toward biomedical approaches and away from their own inner body wisdom. So I, kind of interested not only in working with patients, but also working with clinicians within traditional medicine to make them more sensitive to these kind of healing modalities that people often discover on their own.
So there's some validity there in your perspective. Obviously, like there's the capacity of the being to do something from within to work on the healing process with them.
Yeah, definitely. I'm often in this new book sort of thinking about chronic illnesses that don't necessarily have a cure, like let's say multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease or rheumatoid arthritis. I hear stories about what from a Western point of view would sound like fairly miraculous cures from people using alternative approaches like Qigong or Reiki. Um, but I don't totally trust anything I haven't experienced myself. um, for myself, one of the more you know, miraculous healings, if you want to use that term, which I'm not fully comfortable with because I think they're natural, they're not supernatural, but was using qigong, kind of breathing in energy from the natural world, from the river, from the earth, from the sky, from the trees, because I often walk for a couple of hours a day out in the woods with my dog to deal with a peripheral neuropathy, very painful nerve disease that I'd already had 2 surgeries on. It looked like I'd have to go through a third surgery and just cut the nerve entirely because my pain had become so overwhelming. And in about 2 weeks of using this qigong, the pain alleviated very dramatically. I'm still on medication for it. It can still act up a little bit from time to time, but I didn't have to go to surgery. And when I talk about people use qigong, they're kind of like, "Oh yeah, that's how qi circulates." And it's something that's understood and used in China and Japan. Uh, in the West, we don't quite know what to make of it. It doesn't fit into our, anatomy and physiology of the body as we understand it.
So then, what is that? What's happening there? Like from your point of view. So when we say, "Oh, I'm doing qigong, breathing, and by the river," it's like what, from your point of view, what can you explain? Like, what do you think's happening?
To be honest, I have no idea. I really don't know. Um, I do see an acupuncturist who's been really schooled in the Chinese meridian typology of the body and the balance of kind of the 5 different elements and energies. So there's a whole, cosmological and biological mapping that happens within that culture. And I don't know if that provides an explanatory framework. I haven't gotten deeply enough into it myself to say I believe in it, I agree with it, it
Right.
explains all kinds of phenomena, but um, I'm a big believer in whatever you find to be practically of benefit, whatever kind of practitioner or approach,
Mhm.
um, utilize it. And often they'll use things like breath or touch, elements that are neglected in biomedical practices surrounding, or you focused on pills and surgeries. Um, and so we turn to other cultures like Asian cultures or indigenous cultures for other approaches to understanding the body and healing the body.
Yeah. So on a practical level, though, because I think a lot of the Western, this idea of embodiment doesn't even come up, and there's this kind of mind body split. But somatically speaking, practically speaking, as we're doing the qigong, so like you have the body, like a silent body is a healthy body, but then feeling the body is pain, but then you're feeling the body during qigong, you're making it healthy, like there's some sort of sensation happening, and you're kind of interacting with your body on some level internally. Is that right?
Yeah. I've certainly worked with teachers who have tried to teach me to feel the chi, like to,
Right.
learn how to hold a ball of chi between your 2 hands and feel it. And occasionally I've had that experience. Um, and I think people who are, more experienced practitioners than I, um, just experience it the way I might experience my stomach grumbling when it's hungry. You just feel it as part of your body.
Right.
But a lot of times with these inner body sensations, it takes a kind of cultivated attention
Mhm.
that we're not very good at in the West for the most part. There's a chapter in my that new book, The Healing Body, about interoception, our experience of the internal body.
Mhm.
And I say in the West, we have what we've called this, not what we've called, what I've called it, the superior interior and the inferior interior. The superior interior means that when we hear voices, kind of an internalized, some vocalized pattern that we call thought, kind of an inner dialogue, or sometimes people experience it more through inner imagery. But that's the superior interior because that's thought. That's what we call mind. That's what we call
Mm.
reason. And it enables us to plan, use language, etc. But the inferior interior is all these other experiences and sensations that are coming up from our breathing, from our circulation, from our digestion, which are often explored in other cultures like the chakra system
Mhm.
in Hinduism, or the Chinese experience of the the different energy centers, um, and or just to become more aware when we're growing hungry, or when our body needs exercise, or when we're starting to overeat. Um, this attention to that kind of bodily interior has been really underdeveloped in the West.
Mhm.
Has also been systematically overridden.
Mhm.
Stay at your desk, work your 8 hours, stare at your computer, try to override uh, what your body is telling you that might impair your functionality within society.
Mhm.
So once again, we don't pay attention to it. In fact, we learn to override it. Stay in your seat at school. Don't
Mhm.
get up and go to the bathroom or stretch or go out of the playground. And so we almost have to work hard now to recover a sense of our inner body and value that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's almost you get right, you get punished. You get they're called disorders, ADD, all these things for kids that don't want to sit still, which is a wild idea to put a first grader and say sit in a desk for 8 hours. That's really
Yeah.
odd to try to do that to a kid.
And then let's give you a medication to
Right.
help your body to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Um, so uh, yeah, anyway, you go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Oh no, this is wonderful because I talk to a lot of people about embodiment, and I think that a lot of more work needs to be done as far as like defining this and understanding what's being said because I think people aren't on the same page. So I really like where you're
Yeah.
going with this conversation. I like superior interior and inferior interior. I might not like that it's called the interior, the inferior aspect though is the feeling part.
Yeah.
Maybe we're playing
Uh,
back
just
into their
to
hands.
just to clarify,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
I don't mean myself to call it the inferior. I'm saying in the trajectory of Western culture,
Yes,
it's
yes,
been classified, misclassified as inferior,
yeah.
where actually it embodies a tremendous amount of wisdom that helps us stay healthy or
Mhm,
recover health when we're ill. Um, and one thing, you're talking about maybe different understandings of the body. Uh, and I mentioned I have a book called The Absent Body, this new book, The Healing Body. I realize it can be a little bit misleading because often when we hear the word body, we think of it in kind of biomedical terms,
mhm,
or almost like a material object. My body is, weighs 165 pounds and is 5'11", and here's what it looks like. Um, but there's a tradition, really it started in 20th century, what's called continental philosophy, meaning primarily coming out of continental Europe, France, Germany, etc., of the distinction in the German language, it's a Leib and Körper. Körper is a material body in the world. Leib is a living body. And in phenomenology, the kind of philosophy I do that looks carefully at human experience, we translate that usually as the lived body. And the lived body is not simply what you see in the mirror when you stare at your body as an object. It's the way in which your hands know on a keyboard what keys to strike. It's the way in which your eyes scan a visual horizon. It's the way in which you have certain habits and capacities that your body has mastered that allows you to drive a car or play tennis. It's the way in which we speak and listen to one another expressively. It's our sexual desires and our whole erotic apprehension of the world. So it's kind of the whole way in which the life world, the living world we inhabit, in many ways, it's constituted out of and is constantly interacting with this living body. And so that's not one and the same with the mechanical, measurable body that you place on a scale or you see in the mirror, even though it's not totally separate from that either. It's always both this kind of material entity that we are, something I have, almost like a possession, but then also that which I am. We would say, I am speaking on this podcast, not that my mouth is making sounds on this podcast. And we can move between those polarities when we get sick. That's one of the times we experience the body often as something I have that is rebelling against me. I don't understand what's going on with it. It's not following my intentions. So it begins to feel more alien. But often we just experience, I am my bodily capacities, my lived body.
Yeah. And so there's a lot there to unpack. So, right, if you go to school and you study anatomy, right, at some point you end up looking in the books, and then you end up, maybe with even doing dissection, but this is the material, just raw material. But that doesn't function, that body. That's one point of the story. Like I always say, like, we're really fluids. Like if I cut myself, fluids come out immediately, right? But then also there's the sense of the measurable world. I still feel like we don't even fully take that into consideration. Like we don't really think about, our center of mass and gravity and movement. Like we're not relational in that way in our thinking sometimes, where if we really tune in to the interoceptive aspects of the body, we begin to feel that force, that field of gravity, these things we can't see and touch. It's a massive determiner of movement, nevertheless. And the more we understand, especially like in the martial arts, or especially something like jujitsu or judo or something, these levers and fulcrums and stuff, you have to understand how to work with mass and how to work with yourself in a field of gravity. So you begin to tune into that, and that certainly becomes like, well, this is the body. Without gravity, there's no body. This has to figure in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how we're always both. We're a material entity. We do have to be sensitive to gravity. We have to know whether in reaching for an object on a high shelf, we might pull out our shoulder with the chronic injury. And especially in disciplines like the martial arts, or Tai Chi or yoga, I think one becomes much more sensitive to, and often much more a master of, the elegant and fluid and responsive ways we move through the world. Even yoga postures, which often are held in a stationary position for a period of time. If you think about the names of them as translated into English, mountain pose, lion pose, tree pose, these were ways in which our body resonated with the environment around us back in ancient India, and learned to move or find positions that were once again resonant with the outer natural environment, and therefore healing, stretching and strengthening for the body itself. So I really like what you were saying about, both becoming aware of our body as living, but also as materiality, but also as responsive to the environment, to gravity. And I was talking with a friend of mine who also works in philosophy of the body. We were in a cafe yesterday, and we were talking about how important place is, what place you are. Are you, walking on a forest path, having a conversation with a friend? Are you sitting on sofas in an inviting cafe? Or are you, in the middle of a city street with jackhammers going around and busy pedestrians? That will really change the quality of your conversation, the way in which you hold your body. A lot of that's subconscious, but probably in martial arts and other disciplines like that, you become more able to hold your field of energy, even in environments that are aversive, like that city street. For me, I would probably just be overwhelmed, and I wouldn't be able to have a free body in an environment that was that intrusive.
This brings us to the idea, right? Because I think I 100% agree. And a lot of these arts we're getting, meditation, the Chinese arts, Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, are coming from an era in a culture where nature was, these people were interconnected with nature all day, whether they were farmers or even pre-farmers, like ascetics living in the jungle, like the Buddha or something, or these yogis. And so this sense of connection was an obvious thing to them. It was just they are living in it all the time. But now you say, like, somebody's a modern person living in a city, in an urban environment. I mean, just the sounds alone are so aggressive. Like you almost want to become disembodied, because it's just traumatic being in those environments. Like, your nervous system is overwhelmed constantly, where, like you said, walking on the path every day, breathing in the water, it's like, this is healing. The rhythms are different, the sound, the noises are calming, right? So this idea of the thoughts like becoming disembodied is almost like a protective mechanism of the cognition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. There are certain environments where it is protective to be kind of disembodied, or just to put on your headphones and try to withdraw from the external environment. And it almost seems to me like a closed, self-reverberating circle, because if we're inattentive to the environment, we're not in our bodies, we're not really attending to the environment, we will tend to neglect the environment. We'll be more likely to build an ugly strip mall instead of preserving a lovely green space, because we're just focused on commerce, and we're coming from a disembodied place. But then once we have that ugly strip mall, it kind of forces you to choose to be disembodied. And they have found, I mentioned that I have an MD, and I'm kind of interested in, medical data. And there's a huge body of data about the way in which contact with nature, I think for as little as like 20 minutes a day, brings, big health benefits. You live longer. I've seen a couple of big summary articles in the New York Times. So I'm not talking about just, alternative practitioners saying this. So the more one can have, even a vase of beautiful flowers, or a window you can look out at trees, or a local park you can go walking in, you might think of that almost like taking a medication that will lower your cholesterol or your blood pressure, will improve your health. The natural world functions as that kind of medication because for hundreds of thousands of years, our body evolved uh, in ways that were meant to be embedded in and responsive to that natural world. It wasn't evolving in response to reading horrible international news from all over the planet every day, or being in loud, ugly, intrusive urban environments. Our body kind of curls up and folds upon itself in response to that and creates disease. Uh, by the way, that's an interesting word when you think about it. Disease, if you put in a hyphen, it's dis-ease, being away from ease, that loss of fluidity that you were talking about then causes biological diseases.
Yeah, it does seem like if we talk about disembodiment, it really almost seems like a trauma response, but it's become so common that most people are in this that we don't look at it that way any longer.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I hope to be going to a conference in Hawaii, of all places, trauma and healing. And I think there's more attention being paid to like post-traumatic stress syndrome, not only in war veterans, but people who are emerging from, tough, violent inner city neighborhoods or dysfunctional families. In other words, a series of low-level stressors can accumulate into trauma, not just the big, hurricane or war experience. And so it kind of makes sense to me that we're, a lot of us in a certain way are traumatized. We're just traumatized by the pounding pace and violence and intrusiveness of everyday life. And if I can make one other comment going back to what we were talking about earlier, let's say in yoga, the lion pose or the dog pose or the tree pose, I think of it in terms of shape-shifting, that the human body wants to shapeshift into that which it's responding to, like the tree or the animal or the river, and find itself in that resonance with natural entities. Nowadays, what we do is we plug ourselves into our iPhone or our Samsung or our computer screen. And so essentially, we're kind of shape-shifting as cyborgs, uh, so connected to an electronic environment, internet, social media, etc. It's changing us neurologically, and it's connecting us to the rhythms of machines, in particular addictive features that are put into internet, social media, very fragmented attention, intermittent reinforcement. And so when I teach a course on the environment, one of the first things I do is we talk about how to understand and then detach ourselves from the electronic environment we're so immersed in. Uh, it's one of the things that cuts us off from contact with the natural environment. What's the weather like today? Let me check my iPhone and find out the temperature, the prediction, instead of let me go outside and actually experience in a bodily fashion, the weather that is surrounding us this day.
So I think even like what we were saying earlier, like being put into deaths as kids, I think it's a word that gets used a lot lately, but I don't think it's without reason, like trauma. Like I don't think that that's a natural thing, and that it teaches people or conditions people to be disembodied. And so we lose our natural ability to heal that we would just sort of innately have just by simply being in our bodies and feeling and experiencing the bodies. And there's so I don't know how much you've done with like cognition, like this role of like, right, we have an awareness and we can decide what to pay attention to. I can listen, I can pay attention to sights, but I can also pay attention to body sensations or the thoughts as they come in. it seems as though when we say disembodiment, we're really talking about thought dominated driven behavior. And so, how to distinguish this between these two roles?
Yeah. Um, in the school experience you're describing, we sit behind the desk, even though the body doesn't really want to sit still when you're a child for hours on end in a restricted place. Um, and we're also supposed to be thinking, we're processing ideas that are being presented to us in school. And obviously, that's important in human development. But as you were saying, we're kind of rewarded for thinking and rewarded for doing so in a kind of disembodied way, a way that forces us to detach from our body. And there certainly are a lot of practices, for example, the meditative practice of focusing on the breath, where we finally are trying to still some of that, incredible mind chatter that often is somewhat disturbing, anxiety or depressive, focused, self-focused, projecting into the future rather than being in the present. So kind of dysfunctional, a cause of suffering. We're trying to quiet that down by attending to something within our body, the feel of the breath as it comes in and out through the nostrils, or the movement of belly and chest as we breathe in and out. And, meditation is sometimes thought of as rather disembodied. But I think when you look at the practices, whether it's, Zen meditation or the tantric visualization of a deity, or modes of meditation in motion, like Tai Chi, um, or the meditation of asanas like yoga, they're often about coming back into our body and reuniting body and mind instead of experiencing them dualistically in opposition to one another. They really aren't. We're really body mind, or the lived body, whatever we choose to call it. So dualism, even though it has a long theological and philosophical history in the West, represents a certain kind of maybe disturbed relationship between these two polarities of thought and embodied practice. In let's say in Chinese painting, or the composition of a Japanese haiku, you might sit for a long time in a very embodied way before the mountain or the river, and then however it present itself through you in a haiku, the thought that emerged would come out of your bodily experience and your bodily resonance with the river or the mountain. So I'm just giving that as an example of kind of unified body mind as opposed to body mind dualism.
Yeah. No, I really like that the thoughts coming from the bodily experience, like it wells up and is expressed in that way instead of just running around on the cognitive level. There's even when you talk about it, there's kind of like an anxiety producing idea there when we're disembodied.
Yeah. And if any listeners have that experience of, a mind that runs away from them at 2 a.m. in the morning, making them anxious and not able to go to sleep, it's pretty universal, at least within Western culture, and maybe just in human culture in general. In Buddhism, maybe it came from Hinduism originally, they talk about the monkey mind, where the mind is like a monkey leaping from branch to branch somewhat chaotically. And they go on to say it's actually a drunken monkey mind, like the monkey has gotten into some fermented coconuts and now is drunkenly leaping from branch to branch. And it's a good description of how our mind free associates from some thought to worrying about this, to something that might happen tomorrow, to something that happened a year ago, and creating a lot of internal disturbance.
Hmm. And so you think the somatic practices can go a long way in kind of like developing a maturity and understanding of that mind, helping the monkey settle.
I think they can. There are many different approaches um, to how to help that monkey settle. There's the use of mantra. There's kind of mindful witnessing of your mind. There's even things like psychotherapy, actually sharing with someone else, here's what's going through my mind. And then now that I've told the story has less of a compulsive hold over me, or someone can help me unfold some of the flaws and neurotic patterns within my story. But certainly coming back into your body through some kind of practice. It could be dance, it could be playing an instrument, it could be walking in nature, it could be doing yoga, Tai Chi meditation. Perhaps we all need to cultivate some kind of body-based practice
Mhm.
to recenter ourselves.
And then conversely, it has healing effects on the body. Just by paying attention to the body, it has its own ability to kind of heal, self-regulate, or whatever. Because if we're thinking, the body doesn't know that it'll get anxious over those thoughts and
Yeah,
respond, and compromise immune system, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's true. It's, as an MD, I'll throw out a caution that this doesn't mean that um, your body-based practice or calming your mind will cure everything that is happening to you biologically. The Siddhartha Gautama, the young prince who was to become the Buddha, uh, saw a sick person, an old person, and a corpse, and he realized these were universal to human experience. So I'm a little bit, more than a little bit, resistant to a kind of new age interpretation that every single illness you've created through your mind and you could cure through your mind. Uh, but I think there are quite a number, particularly things that are stress related, where a tremendous amount of healing can take place, or pain reduction can take place through recentering within your body. There are definitely many illnesses that can be prevented, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, related to stress, digestive problems. These might be prevented by having a calming bodily based practice. And even if you have a disease that will not be prevented or cured, uh, probably your emotional reactivity will lessen if you have a calming body based practice. Maybe you have rheumatoid arthritis and you're in the middle of a flare up. And instead of spinning into anxiety and fear about the future and frustration, anger toward your body, you go into a kind of the use of a calming mantra. Um, that's going to lessen your reactivity. It's probably going to lessen the pain of the flare up. It might lessen the length of the flare up because of your ability to respond to it more skillfully.
Mhm. No, no, I'm glad you said that. Everything that's very reasonable, right? Like just being in the body, paying attention to the body, having a practice. There's obviously lots of preventative things, but right, we still a toothache, you're gonna have to see a dentist. Think you're
Yeah,
with this, but they have, they've shown like, if you keep your vitality up, your energy up, and you're healthy, even getting out of a surgery, you tend to heal quicker, right? You don't not do the surgery, but there's many
yeah,
benefits, and we're not so good at preventative accounting for, right? It's kind of hard to write on paper. Well, you've done your body practice, so you prevented 1, 2, 3, 4.
yeah,
We don't really. It's kind of hard to, in a materialistic view, that doesn't really add up so clearly for us.
yeah. And unfortunately, at least in the United States, the biomedical system, the economic incentives in order to get sick, have expensive treatment, have to buy those expensive medications or those expensive surgeries. So if everybody's doing yoga and breathing exercises and don't get sick so often to begin with, there's a threat of tremendous economic loss to the biomedical industrial complex. On the other hand, to be a little bit forgiving to the system, there are now more and more insurance companies that incentivize, and companies that incentivize employee wellness programs, and actually will pay for yoga classes or acupuncture because they know the insurance companies will be saving money if you're getting sick less often. So there's kind of interesting incentives, pro and con, this movement toward somatic body work and preventative medicine.
Mm-hmm. So you're seeing some sort of change happening within the medical or in the society at large with this? You think there's a way forward here?
I think so. I think enough critiques, personal critiques, cultural critiques have come out against the enormous expense and waste and side effects and dehumanization of the medical system, that sometimes collectively, sometimes just individual by individual, we are trying to rediscover our own powers of self-healing, or we're visiting alternative practitioners, or we're taking herbal treatments or homeopathic treatments. And not all of these are effective for individuals. So I think one has to be, once again, be sort of attentive to what is working for oneself. And I'll put in a good word for the placebo effect. Yeah, probably everyone has heard that term. And it's often used sort of in a diminishing way. Oh, it's just the placebo effect. You thought you were getting better. And if you're doing a clinical trial in medicine, you have to have a control group that maybe thinks they're getting the medicine, but it's just getting a sugar pill to control for the placebo effect. But what this is indicating is the placebo effect is so powerful that it's there in the background of every medical experiment. We have to find out whether the pill has any effect beyond that of the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is really when somebody believes that something is helping them, it summons up their internal bodily ability to heal themselves. They think it's the sugar pill doing it, but the belief in the sugar pill is simply potentiating their own body's capacity to lower pain, to improve movement, to heal from disease. So we have this tremendous capacity within our body. In fact, my father, who was a physician in New York, a well-known, probably expensive, Manhattan physician, said, "I'll tell you a secret." I was just a kid. So I'll tell you a secret. My patients come to me and say, "Doctor, you're so wonderful. You saved my life. You cured my disease." The secret is I did very little. Their body did it, and then I got the credit for it.
Yeah.
So I remember that from when I was about 10 years old.
Yeah. That's interesting because I feel like, there was a different kind of doctor-patient relationship than there is now, where it's become even more clinical, more dependent upon like pills and less time and face relationship with the doctor. It's like a family doctor used to sort of be a friend of the whole family and would spend time with you, and which would give you a kind of feeling of security, like this person cares about me, they're familiar,
Yeah.
they talk to me, they're asking me how the kids, the life, my job is, which we still find in like a lot of the alternative medicines. I think just that aspect where it's like the acupuncturist will do an intake and talk to you. There's this sense of relationship and also personal responsibility on the side of the patient. They're not just coming to you like, fix me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that relationship between the practitioner and the patient potentiates that placebo effect.
Yeah.
You feel like you're with someone whose presence is healing.
Mhm.
And a certain amount of healing takes place in the conversation, someone recognizing and understanding the suffering you're going through, or knowing you from a long, history.
Mhm.
Like I mentioned, when I was 10 years old, and my father was a Manhattan physician, but he was still doing house calls on Saturday.
Yeah.
And if one of his patients was a celebrity, he would drag me along to meet, Tina from Gilligan's Island or something. So that was part of medicine back in the day. And I feel like that close relationship with the practitioner, which is one of the reasons many people now turn to alternative practitioners, they're not getting it through their traditional physician, has a healing effect almost independent of the particular body practice and technique that the treater is also utilizing. In fact, somebody was telling me, this may relate. I was talking with somebody about what kind of psychotherapy is appropriate for a family member of mine, cognitive behavioral therapy or in-depth psychiatry, and he said, they've done this study where they showed videotapes of therapists from many different traditions, Maslow self-actualization therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, Freudian psychotherapy. Uh, and they asked people, clinicians, to identify which schools each of the therapists belonged to. And they were totally unable to do so because the bottom line was a good therapist is a good therapist. It doesn't even matter what their training was or what school of thought they're supposedly putting into practice. They have a therapeutic presence, a therapeutic relationship with the patient. And that's almost more important than, once again, their particular training and practice. And that might be true with certain forms of body work, that you might see a Reiki practitioner or a massage therapist or someone who's working with acupressure, an Alexander technique, treater. And they are bringing certain things to the table, metaphorically, sometimes literally. But it also might be something about their embodied presence and the way that heals you or potentiates your own embodied capacity for healing. Does
Yeah.
that make sense to you? You're a body
Yeah.
somatic practitioner. Yeah.
No, I think that makes total sense. And like, even saying placebo, I think we can, if we, as you're saying this, I think of, because I have friends and family members who are doctors and physicians, and there's like time limits. They can only spend so much time with somebody in the hospital, then they got to move on to the next one. And it's like what a disembodied day they live, with their mind constantly thinking, I only have so many minutes. And it's depersonalized, where, like you said, they're going to the people's house, they're probably having tea or dinner or coffee with them. There's this relationship. It's like sitting with a friend, and talking. You automatically feel more relaxed, you feel like you're being heard. And
Uh,
we don't, how do you calculate that? How do you put a price tag on that? Right? It's like an insurance company, they're
yeah.
going just the opposite way.
Yeah. I know the insurance company does want clinicians to see 4 patients an hour, one patient every 15 minutes, order expensive diagnostic tests and procedures. Or at least maybe the insurance company doesn't want that, but the medical center wants that. And so even though a lot of people are kind of angry with doctors for being, dehumanizing or rushed or inattentive, staring at the computer instead of staring at me, those doctors are under tremendous pressure from the systems they're embedded in. They have to be staring at the computer and entering data while they're talking to you because they don't have enough time to do it between sessions. So they may never really look up at you very much. They're staring at a computer screen, but they kind of have to be. It's not their fault, Time is money.
Yeah, there's a whole kind of disembodied breakdown that's happening. Like you said, it's like the more we don't look at the external world, the worse it gets, the more trauma. It's a cycle, right? The more we
Uh,
stay. And so you can visit a doctor and you feel more isolated than if you were even by yourself.
Yeah. And I was reading an article a couple of days ago, I think it was the New York Times, might have been the Washington Post, about the tremendous trauma circulating through healthcare workers. Hundreds of thousands have quit um, since COVID and during COVID. Tremendous levels of anxiety and depression uh, among healthcare workers because it's become such a dehumanizing and pressurized environment, especially since COVID. So if it's not a healing environment for them, how much can they be healers for the patients who come through the door?
I think there was a study, based the work on mindfulness education in hospitals with John Kabat-Zinn up there in Massachusetts. Was they did a big study with nurses and the way they disembodied to maintain their own sanity through the day, and then how to learn like compassion practices, how to bring them back into communication, but also being able to be safe in that environment. Like that's a skill that people don't know. There's almost this point where things have gotten to such a point where we have to figure out how to deal with this environment we've created. We have to figure out a way to transcend it. We're not in nature anymore. We're not running from, living the day to day in nature, but we've got this new environment we've created, but we don't understand what we've created in a certain way. We don't know how to deal with it or maneuver it.
Yeah. I mean, certainly in medical environments, hospitals, they're constructed in such a way for technological and economic efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be able to wheel in an EKG. You want to be able to, lower the side of the bed and have medical students and physicians cluster around. You want to be able to move patients from room to room and subdivide those rooms. So they're not constructed as healing environments. There's not the presence of the natural world. They're not often objects of beauty, Tibetan tapestries on the wall. Occasionally, you will find examples. For example, in India, the followers of Sai Baba, an Indian guru,
Mm-hmm.
uh, constructed these beautiful hospitals uh, whose different wings, the wings of the hospital were constructed to be an imitation of the arms of the guru wrapping themselves around you. And a friend of mine was the cardiological consultant helping them set up the best of Western medical techniques. But they also were trying to make the entirety of the environment a place of healing, both for the healthcare workers and for the patients who came within it. They hired somebody who's famous for doing so-called sacred architecture.
Mm-hmm.
They had statues of Hindu healing deities, the first thing you would see when you would come into the hallway. So there are a few examples you can find. But for most of us, if we can stay out of the hospital, that's our best option.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, in that mentality, I think in and of itself makes us feel a little ill about the whole thing, right? We shouldn't have to feel that way about the place that's supposed to heal us. Like, really, you go to a hospital or a doctor, like the best news is no news. You don't leave feeling good. Like you go to acupuncture, you leave, you feel energized. Oh, that was a nice experience. You go to the doctor's, like, they tell me that everything's fine. That's the best I can hope for. I'm not going to feel better. I'm just going
yeah,
to be relieved that I don't
that's
have
a
to
really
walk
good
the
point.
thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The best news is just no news. Your labs came back and they were unremarkable. But you're right. When you go to an acupuncturist office, there might be a beautiful tapestry on the wall. There might be incense. There might be gentle music playing. And before any needles are employed, uh, you're greeted with warmth. You've come into an environment of healing. The body begins to relax, and the chi begins to flow, probably even before the needles have been inserted.
And they touch, they're doing the pulse. There's that human touch that I've gone to many doctors in the last few years. There's no touch between me and the doctor at all. They don't ever put their hands on me. And I like to get my pulse read. I like the doctor to shake my hand and put their arm around me and feel my knee or my whatever it is. I want that. Um, and something you said earlier too, like when the doctor's rushing in and out and they have a time frame, it's like back to the embodied experience. It's like, the embodied experience, whether it's meditation, Tai Chi, Qigong, whatever, it's like there's a time element there. It requires a certain amount of time to settle into the body. It's not just like a thought's quick, right? You say something, I have a thought right away, it's just right there. But to settle into the body, like, going into nature, if we lived in nature, it might be more readily available. But for us living in these other environments where we are kind of like disembodied by survival, it takes a moment or even longer to sit and get in touch with those sensations of the body. So if I'm on a time restraint, it's just not going to happen most likely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mentioned earlier that our bodies grew up in evolutionary connection, of course, with the natural world. And usually the natural world operates very slowly,
Yeah.
almost to the point where it appears to be stillness, even though there's constant subtle movement. And so you might say bodily time often unfolds slowly. You can't instantly you can't instantly do yoga. I've got 10 minutes to do yoga, quick.
Yeah.
You have to settle into it. And often alternative practitioners, they have schedules as well. We have to, but they often will give you a full hour as opposed to 20 minutes, which gives your time body to settle into the treatment. There was an interesting study where when a traditional medical clinician takes a history from their patient, this is the moment when the doctor is supposed to be listening. Tell me the story of your illness. When did you first notice the symptoms? Anything you take to be relevant. Um, However, they found that on average, the clinician interrupted the patient within 7 seconds of them starting to tell the story, because it was some form of get to the point, time is a wasting, let's hone in on what's most important clinically. You mentioned the word pain. Can you be more specific about the quality of the pain, the location of the pain? And so the patients have about 7 seconds to just tell their own story before the clinician has even taken over the history. Of course, they're also in charge of the physical. They're also in charge of ordering diagnostic laboratory results. But even the story is very quickly taken over by the doctor.
Yeah, and we feel that. Yeah. Elizabeth Hasu pointed you out to me in an interview I had with her a while back. I was presenting a Buddhist view of the body, and she was presenting a Taoist view.
Oh, nice.
And she was really caught up in the external thing, and I was like, we think about the internal and embodiment. She was like, well, have you read his book? She's like, where you don't have a body, and by not having a body, you connect to the environment. And that was like, yeah. It reminded me of D.E. Harding and Alan Watts.
Yeah, I was very influenced by Alan Watts when I was young. And it's so interesting. I was just talking with someone else who does this kind of somatic phenomenology, but he's learned Chinese, he's learned Japanese, he studied Sanskrit. So he's very deeply into Asian traditions. He's a German philosopher, but his works a lot with the concept of qi. And he also was inspired as a young man by Alan Watts. So many people, I'm glad that name is still, remembered by people.
I loved Alan Watts. I read all of his books, like What is Zen, all this, when I was getting into all this as a teenager.
Me as well. What is Zen was the book that sort of transformed my life when I was like 17.
Yeah. But I could never get past. I had stored that away as a memory, and so when she said it, and your work popped up in relationship to what I knew with him, and I was like, I've always wanted to delve into that further and ask him, well, that does make sense, but there's another part where it doesn't make sense with the embodied. Because then I pressed her. I was like, because she studied Yi Jing with a teacher in China, so a form of qigong, and I'm like, so in your article you wrote, your teacher specifically says don't be pulled up by the head, push up from the inside. So I'm like, by not having a body, you can't do that pushing up, right? You have to have some sort of felt
Yeah.
internal direction to make this happen consciously. And so she sort of worked around. She's like, yeah, you're right. I was doing that. But her whole philosophy was like not to have a body. And I'm like, yeah, these two things always seem, how do you congeal these two ideas? I know
Yeah.
both of them are true, but how are they true? How do we marry
Yeah.
these two ideas?
Yeah. I was thinking, this German philosopher and I were discussing this yesterday. It's funny. Uh, in that nice cafe environment I was mentioning. In my first book, The Absent Body, the last chapter is called To Form One Body. And it uses a kind of Neo-Confucian philosopher who said we all have the same chi inside us and surrounding us in the cosmos. That's why the human-hearted person kind of forms one body with others in compassion, forms one body in the appreciation of the beauty and reverence for nature. And in my newer book, The Healing Body, the last chapter is called The Transparent Body. How do we make our body more open, transparent, communicative with the world, ultimately in a way that's non-dual, like a non-duality between inside and outside, self and other, self and God, as a kind of, realized state. Uh, However, that said, our body does need a border. It needs a distinction between inside and outside. It needs, obviously it needs food, it needs air, which are modes of connection to the environment, but it also needs protection against the environment and separation. And at least in Zen, I have a friend who's quite a student of Zen tradition and quite a Zen teacher. And he was emphasizing to me the other day the concept that is translated as non-dual means not one and not two, that neither duality nor monism are satisfactory because both are always at play in interesting ways. I'm one with the world, but I'm not one with the world. There's no distinction between inside and outside my body, but there is a distinction between inside and outside my body. Um,
Yeah, a lot of my Western students shift to the monoism when they first start
mhm.
practicing. They're like, well, all is one. And they go to this sort of dull gray thing, right? Where there's no black or white. It's just blah, blah, like everything's one. And they sort of leave it at this.
uh,
And this is why I think are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work on the,
no,
he as a Westerner, he's done a phenomenal job with this, but it's essentially, there and all the Eastern practices, like it's the idea of the non-conceptual. It's like it's non-dual and dual simultaneously. It's just but our concepts don't work this way. Our concepts need a 1 + 1 = 2, right? And I see the whole
uh,
economic thing is like based on this idea of the conceptual, but it completely the embodied experience isn't a conceptual event. It's a non-conceptual state, right? It's like I feel
uh,
I know the chi or feel it. You can call it chi or sensation. It doesn't matter what you label it. I know when I'm feeling versus cognizing. And these are two different ways of paying attention or being in the world. And if they're at odds, we're in a bunch of problems. But if we can marry those two things and understand how they function and harmonize them, then it's really no predicament at all, right?
yeah. And sometimes I was talking once again with this German philosopher, and he was saying how his father, I think, had been very sick, and he reached out and he kind of manipulated the five fingers of his hand in a certain way that his father immediately began to heal very dramatically. And he had no intellectual understanding of why his body knew to do that with his father's body. I mean, he studied chi, but it wasn't like he was using a very particular, meridian-based approach to relieve a particular problem with the liver or whatever. So sometimes our intellect is really unable to track along with the subconscious wisdom of our body. But then other times, like this friend of mine who's a practitioner and a professor in Zen emphasizes that even though the Zen tradition is often seen as very anti-intellectual, get out of your mind, just sit, meditate, follow your breath, work on your koan, explode the reasoning mind. He said, no, there's a tremendous amount of sutras that are written in the Zen tradition. There's a whole intellectual part of the Zen tradition, and it's something of a Western misunderstanding based on certain elements of Zen, that Zen wants us to just put aside our reasoning mind. It's more bringing mind and body together, as we were talking about, and not letting one wander too far away from the other.
Yeah, I think that's in the Zen thing is, I think that's true. Somehow the message came in that don't think, ignore the cognition, and just be, and then you'll be enlightened through that. Like just so now you've set up another dualism though, like the thoughts are bad. Somehow
Yeah,
the obstacle instead of our relationship, instead of mature. My background is Zen, but then I got really into Tibetan Buddhism and went to India and Nepal and lived in the monasteries and started to study the curriculum, the Nalanda curriculum, as the Dalai Lama calls it. So low reek, mind science and stuff. And for me, that they just resolved. That's all they deal with. It's so nice, especially coming from the Zen that was brought to me from the martial arts, which is just don't think, just do.
yeah,
Because I know that you're right with if you would live in those cultures and study in the Zen monasteries, there's a tremendous amount of intellectual study there as well.
yeah. My understanding from a distance, which doesn't compare to your understanding up close, is even especially in the Dalai Lama's school of Tibetan Buddhism, is a tremendous focus on intellectual development, the memorization of texts, the debating of texts in this kind of dramatic embodied fashion. Boom. And so a very meditative tradition, but also a very intellectual tradition.
Very
Interesting person. It's been a fun interview. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion.